Madagascar is the fourth largest island on Earth. It broke away from the African mainland around 165 million years ago, and from the landmass that would become India around 88 million years ago, and it has been drifting alone in the Indian Ocean ever since. In all that time, tens of millions of years with no bridge to anywhere, it did something almost no other place on the planet managed to do. It became a world of its own. 90% of its mammals live nowhere else. 95% of its reptiles. More than 8 in every 10 of its plants. And in the last 60 years, it has burned away close to half of its forests. The single place that carries more life found nowhere else than almost any country on Earth is also, by most measurements, the place losing that life the fastest. The people lighting the fires are not strangers. They are Malagasy farmers, most of them poor, doing what every generation before them has done, clearing a patch of forest to plant rice, because there is no other way to feed the people standing in front of them. Both things are true at the same moment. The island cannot afford to lose what it carries, and it cannot afford to stop the people who are taking it. So the question is not whether Madagascar is a paradise or a tragedy. It is something harder than either. How does a world like this survive the century? To understand the island, you have to understand that it is not really an island at all, not in the way we usually mean the word. It is a piece of a continent. 600 million years ago, there was a single enormous landmass we now call Gondwana. Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, Australia. All of them were locked together into one body, and Madagascar sat near the middle of it, pressed between the land that would become Africa and the land that would become India. Then the body began to come apart. The Earth's crust pulled and tore, oceans opened in the seams, and the great pieces drifted off toward the positions they hold today. Madagascar went with the eastern half. First, it parted from Africa. Then, tens of millions of years later, India tore away from its eastern flank and went north, on the long journey that would eventually drive it into Asia and raise the Himalayas. And Madagascar was left behind, alone. A long slab of ancient continent, roughly the size of France and Belgium and the Netherlands combined, set adrift in warm water with nothing around it but sea. This is the fact that explains almost everything else. Because when a piece of land is cut off for that long, evolution stops being a shared story and becomes a private one. On the mainland, life keeps mixing. New animals arrive, old ones leave. The gene pool is constantly stirred. On an island this isolated, nothing arrives. Whatever was on board when the bridge closed, or whatever managed, very rarely, to drift across the open ocean on a raft of vegetation, became the entire cast of characters. And from that small starting cast, with no competition from outside and millions of years to work with, evolution began filling every empty role with whatever it had on hand. There were no monkeys here, so an early line of primates spread into the gap and became the lemurs. More than 100 species of them, from a creature that could sit in the palm of your hand to one the size of a large dog. There were no big cats, so a single ancestor evolved into a sleek, muscular hunter that climbs like a cat and is found nowhere else. There were no woodpeckers, so a lemur grew a long, thin finger to do the woodpecker's job.
How did those first animals even get here?
That is the strange part. By the time lemurs appear in the record, Madagascar had been cut off from Africa for tens of millions of years. There was no land bridge to walk across. The best explanation scientists have is almost too unlikely to believe, that the ancestors of the lemurs and of most of the island's mammals arrived by accident, rafting. A storm tears a tangled mat of vegetation loose from an African river mouth. A few small animals are clinging to it. The mat is swept out into the Mozambique Channel, and the ocean currents, which in the deep past flowed toward Madagascar, carry it for weeks across hundreds of kilometers of open sea. Almost every raft fails, but across tens of millions of years, a handful succeed. A pregnant female here, a tiny group there, and each rare arrival becomes the seed of a whole new branch of life. That is why the cast of characters is so small and so strange. Only a few founding lines ever made the crossing. There are lemurs but no monkeys, no antelope, no zebra, no lions. None of the great animals of Africa that would have walked over a bridge if a bridge had ever existed. The empty roles were left for the castaways to fill. Biologists call it adaptive radiation, and Madagascar is the clearest case of it anywhere on Earth. A few survivors, an empty stage, and all the time in the world. Scientists sometimes call Madagascar the eighth continent. It is a useful phrase, and we will come back to it, because by the end, it will mean something very different from how it sounds now. You can read the deep history of the place in its skin. Fly over the Central Highlands, and the land is red. A deep, rusted, oxidized red that runs for hundreds of kilometers. The Malagasy call their home the Great Red Island, and after heavy rain, the rivers carry that red soil down to the coast in plumes so wide they can be seen from space, staining the ocean the color of old blood. We will come back to that color too. Hold on to it. The red of the earth is going to matter more than it looks like it should. But to feel how much this isolated world has already changed, you have to go looking for the things that are no longer here. Walk the dry south of the island, in a place called the Christmas River, and beneath the ground there is a bone bed, a dense layer of ancient animal remains pressed into the old marsh. And the bones tell you that Madagascar was once stranger than anything alive on it today. Stand in that landscape 10,000 years ago, and you are not alone. A bird is moving through the brush ahead of you, but it is not a bird as you know one. It stands 3 meters tall. It weighs perhaps 500 kilograms, as much as a large horse. It cannot fly. It never needed to. Its egg is larger than any egg a dinosaur ever laid, large enough to feed a family. This is the elephant bird, and it is only the headline act. Beside it move giant tortoises the size of armchairs, pygmy hippos that wallow in the rivers, and giant lemurs, some as large as a gorilla, that move slowly through the trees, because on an island with no leopards, there was never any reason to be quick. And above all of them flew a predator built to match. A giant eagle, larger than any bird of prey alive today, with talons strong enough to take a giant lemur out of the canopy. On an island with no big cats and no wolves, the largest hunter was a bird, and the thing it hunted was a primate. There was a giant fossa too, a supersized version of the cat-like predator that still survives. This is what isolation does given enough time. It does not only shrink some animals and enlarge others at random, it rebuilds an entire food web from the few pieces it was handed, until the island has its own grazers, its own browsers, its own apex hunters, all of them related to nothing on the mainland. All of them are gone now, every single one. The largest land animal left in Madagascar today weighs less than 10 kilograms. For a long time, the story seemed simple. People arrived on the island, and not long after, the giants vanished, so people must have hunted them out. But the bones complicate that. Those elephant bird bones at the Christmas River carry cut marks from human tools, and when they were dated, they came back at more than 10,000 years old, thousands of years older than anyone thought humans had been here at all. Which means humans and the giants may have shared this island for a very long time, perhaps 9,000 years, without the giants disappearing. The killing blow, when it came later, when farming spread, when fires spread, when the forest itself began to shrink. So the first thing to understand about Madagascar is this: a world has already ended here once. The giants are not a legend. They were real and they were lost, and the loss was recent enough that the people who watched it happen had names. Remember the elephant bird. We are going to meet its shadow again. But the world that remains is still one of the most remarkable on Earth, and nowhere is that clearer than in the rainforests of the East. The eastern edge of Madagascar is a wall. A long spine of mountains runs down the length of the island, and the wet winds blowing in off the Indian Ocean hit that wall and rise and cool and drop their rain. The result is a band of rainforest along the entire eastern coast. Dense, dripping, layered, some of the richest forest left anywhere in the tropics. And here is the strange thing about that wall. It does not only make the east, it makes the south. Because everything that rains out on the eastern slope never reaches the far side. The clouds arrive empty over the southwest, and so the same island that holds emerald rainforest on one coast holds thorn and dust and near desert on the other. One mountain range, two opposite worlds. Keep that division in mind, because the dry side of that line is where this story is going to end. In the eastern forest at dawn, you hear it before you see anything. A long, rising, eerie call, somewhere between a whale's song and a siren, that carries for more than 2 kilometers through the trees. It is the sound of the Indri, the largest lemur alive. The Indri sings in family groups, the calls answering each other across the canopy, marking territory, holding the family together. Local people call it Babakoto, which can be understood as something like father or ancestor of man, and in many villages it is Fadi, taboo, to harm one. The story told is that the Indri is kin, that long ago a man and an Indri were brothers, and one stayed in the forest. To kill it would be to kill family. The Indri has another quality that will matter later. It cannot live in captivity. It has been tried again and again in zoos and breeding centers around the world, and it fails every time. The animal's diet, its social structure, its sheer need for the living forest is too specific to reproduce inside walls. There is no Indri in any zoo on Earth. If the eastern forest goes, the Indri goes with it. There is no safe copy held somewhere else, no backup. What lives in the trees is the whole of the species, and nothing more. The Indri is only one shape the lemurs took. There is the sifaka, which crosses open ground in a way that has to be seen to be believed. Unable to walk on all fours, it stands upright and bounds sideways across the earth in long, springing leaps, arms raised like a dancer crossing a stage. There is the ring-tailed lemur of the dry south, the one with the banded tail held high like a flag, the face the cartoons borrowed. And there is the smallest of them all, the mouse lemur, the smallest primate on the planet, light enough to sit in a spoon, with eyes too large for its head, foraging alone through the dark for insects and fruit. From a single rafting ancestor, evolution made a primate the size of a child and a primate the size of your thumb, and set them both loose in the same forest. And then there is the Malagasy fear. After dark, in the eastern forest, something moves along a branch with a strange, deliberate care. It is a lemur, but it does not look like one. It has the ears of a bat, teeth that grow throughout its life like a rodent's, and a third finger so long and thin and skeletal it seems to belong to something dead. This is the eye, and it is one of the most singular animals alive. That finger is a tool. The eye taps along a branch, tapping, listening, tapping, using the echo to find the hollow tunnels where grubs are burrowing under the bark. When it hears one, it gnaws a small hole with those ever-growing teeth, then reaches in with the long finger and hooks the grub out. It is doing the work a woodpecker does on other continents, with a method no other mammal on Earth uses. Echolocation by knuckle, a creature that hunts by knocking on wood. But the eye carries a darker inheritance than its strangeness. In many parts of Madagascar, it is fadey, and not the protective kind. It is believed to be an omen of death. The story says that if an eye points that long finger at you, someone will die, and the only way to prevent it is to kill the animal. And so, for generations, eyes have been killed on sight, nailed up outside villages as a warning. A creature that survived 88 million years of isolation, undone in part by a superstition about a finger. It is one of the places where the island's reverence for the unseen world turns, for a single animal, into a death sentence. And the Indri is one note in an extraordinary chorus. Madagascar holds about half of all the chameleon species on the planet, from a giant nearly the length of your forearm to a chameleon small enough to balance on the head of a match. The island grows 6 or 7 of the world's handful of baobab species. Its rivers and forests hold hundreds of frogs, hundreds of snails, butterflies and beetles and spiders, the overwhelming majority of which exist on this one landmass and no other. To understand the human world of the island, you go up onto the central highlands, the cool, terraced heart where most Malagasy live. The first people reached Madagascar across an enormous distance and from an unexpected direction. They did not come from Africa, 90 minutes of flight to the west. They came from the other side of the Indian Ocean, from the islands of Southeast Asia, from the region of Borneo, more than 7,000 kilometers away, in outrigger canoes, perhaps 1,500 years ago. Later, they mixed with Bantu peoples from the African mainland and with Arab and Indian traders along the coasts. But the deepest root is Austronesian, and you can still hear it. The Malagasy language is not African. It is a cousin of the languages of Indonesia and the Pacific, a people from one ocean planted on the edge of another. On the highlands, every few years, in the cool, dry months, a family will gather and do something that startles outsiders who do not understand it. They open the tomb of an ancestor. They lift out the wrapped remains, carry them into the light, and rewrap them in fresh silk shrouds. And then, and this is the part that surprises people, they celebrate. There is music, there is dancing. The living carry the dead above their heads and move with them around the tomb in the open air before returning them gently to the earth. It is called famadihana, the turning of the bones. And it is not mourning, it is a reunion. To the Malagasy who keep this tradition, the dead are not gone. They are Razana, ancestors, present and powerful, watching over the family, and the relationship with them has to be maintained, renewed, spoken to, fed. The festival is the moment the family introduces its newest members to its oldest ones, asks for blessing, shares the news of the years that have passed. It tells you something about how this culture holds time. The past is not behind you here, it is beside you. And that idea that what came before is still present, still owed something, runs underneath the whole of Malagasy life, in the web of fadi that governs which days you may bury the dead, which animals you may not eat, which patches of forest you may not cut, because the ancestors are in them. Long before the kingdom, the coasts had their own visitors. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, the bays and river mouths of the east, above all, a small green island off the northeast coast called Île Sainte-Marie, became a haven for pirates working the Indian Ocean trade routes. Some of the most notorious names of the age careened their ships here, buried in the warm sand. Out of that world grew the legend of Libertalia, a supposed free colony founded by pirates somewhere on Madagascar, a place with no kings and no slaves, where the loot was shared and every man had a vote. No one has ever proven Libertalia existed, but the legends stuck to the island like sea spray, and there is an old pirate cemetery on Sainte-Marie still, the graves leaning under the palms, skull and crossbones worn almost smooth by 300 years of rain. The highlands were also the seat of power. By the early 1800s, a single kingdom, the Marina, had risen out of the central plateau and brought much of the island under one crown, ruled from the city of Antananarivo. There were missionaries and printing presses and a written form of the language. There was also cruelty. Under one queen, Ranavalona I, suspected criminals and political enemies were forced to swallow poison from the tangena nut to prove their innocence, a practice that is thought to have killed thousands of people every year. And then, from the outside, came France. The French had wanted the island for a long time. In 1885, they forced a treaty. The British, in exchange for a free hand in Zanzibar, agreed to look the other way. But the Marina Prime Minister kept his army, and so France decided to take what the treaty had only promised. January 1895. A French expeditionary force lands on the northwest coast, at Mahajanga, and begins to march inland toward the capital. The fighting itself is almost one-sided. France loses only a small number of men in battle. But the island fights back in another way. Fever, dysentery, the climate itself, and thousands of French soldiers die of disease on the road to the highlands. September the 30th, 1895. The French reach Antananarivo and take the city. The Queen, Ranavalona III, signs what she is told to sign. She is kept on her throne for a moment as a figurehead, and then she is removed, exiled, first to the island of Réunion, then to Algeria, thousands of kilometers from the country she had ruled. She dies in Algiers in 1917, and she never sees Madagascar again. Remember that signature, a sovereign made to put her name to terms written by someone else, on land that was hers. It is the shape of a story that keeps repeating on this island. The kingdom was abolished, Madagascar became a French colony, and resistance did not stop. In the highlands, guerrilla bands called the Menelamba, the Red Shawls, named for the red earth they smeared on their clothes, fought on. They were crushed. And the island's isolation never fully protected it from the world's wars. In 1942, with France fallen to Germany and Madagascar governed by the collaborationist Vichy administration, the Allies feared that Japan might seize the great deep-water harbor at Diego Suarez on the northern tip, one of the finest natural ports in the Indian Ocean, and use it to cut the sea route to India and the Middle East. So British forces invaded. They came ashore in May, fought their way across the north, and took the port and eventually the island, holding it for the rest of the war. For the Malagasy, it was one more army arriving on their shores to fight over their land for reasons decided somewhere else. A piece of the planet wanted not for itself, but for where it sat on the map. And then there is 1947. By the late 1940s, the pressure has built for decades. Taxes, forced labor, land taken, a people governed by foreigners in their own country. On the night of the 29th of March, 1947, it breaks. Malagasy nationalists rise across the eastern part of the island, attacking French installations. The uprising spreads until it covers a third of the country. The French response is overwhelming. Reinforcements arrive, villages are burned, people flee into the eastern forests, the same dripping forests of the Indre, and there, hiding from both sides, many of them die of hunger and cold and fear. Soldiers strap suspected rebels under aircraft. Prisoners are executed. The official French count of the dead was around 11,000. Malagasy and later estimates run far higher, 60,000, 80,000, some higher still. The exact number was never agreed, and that itself is part of the wound. A revolt that should be famous in a country most of the world cannot place on a map, leaving a hole in the population that no one ever fully measured. Madagascar became independent on the 26th of June, 1960, but it entered its freedom poor and damaged and carrying a memory that the wider world had never bothered to learn. Leave the highlands and the wounds and go west, down toward the dry coast, because there is something there that almost everyone has seen in a photograph without knowing where it was. A dirt road runs across the flat, hot land near the town of Morondava, and along it stand a line of trees that look like they have been planted upside down. Vast, smooth, swollen trunks, far too thick for their height, with a small tangle of branches at the very top, like roots reaching for the sky. These are baobabs, and this stretch of road is called the Avenue of the Baobabs. It is the single most photographed place on the island. But the postcard hides something. These baobabs are old, some of them 800 years, perhaps more, and they did not grow up beside a road across an open plain. They grew up inside a forest. The dry forest that once surrounded them has been cleared, tree by tree, for farmland and charcoal, until only the baobabs were left standing, because a baobab trunk is too fibrous and too full of water to make good firewood, and too sacred in local belief to cut without cause. So the famous avenue is not a garden, it is a graveyard. Each of those giant trees is a survivor standing over the ghost of a forest that is no longer there. The thing tourists travel across the world to photograph is, if you understand what you are looking at, a row of headstones. Further north, along the western side, the land does something the eye can barely accept. The rain that fell over millions of years dissolved the limestone bedrock into a forest of stone. Thousands of grey blades and pinnacles, razor-edged, rising 30, 40, 50 meters, packed so tightly a person can barely move between them. The Malagasy name says it plainly. Tsingy, the place where you cannot walk barefoot. And inside this stone forest, life took shelter. The pinnacles are so sharp and the gaps so deep that much of the Tsingy is effectively sealed off from people, and so its own species evolved in the cracks and on the tops of the spires. Lemurs that leap between knife-edged towers, plants rooted in pockets of soil no farmer could ever reach. It is one of the few places on the island where the wildlife is protected not by a law, but by the simple fact that the landscape will cut anyone who tries to take it. Where the rock could be crossed, the forest fell. Where it could not, the forest lives. The map of what survives in Madagascar is, again and again, a map of what was too hard to reach.
The stone forest itself
Was carved by water, slowly, over millions of years. Rain is faintly acidic, and limestone dissolves in it. And where the rain ran in cracks, it ate the rock downward into blades and slots, and beneath the surface, into a labyrinth of caves and underground rivers. Further north, in the massif of Ankarana, those caves run for kilometers, and in their darkness hang colonies of bats and pale, blind creatures that have adapted to a life without light, while crocodiles wait in the black underground pools. And far to the south, the sandstone massif of Isalo has been sculpted by the same patient force into canyons and natural pools where palms grow in green pockets out of bare rock. Wind, rain, and time are the island's oldest sculptors, and they work in stone the way evolution worked in flesh, slowly, strangely, and towards something found nowhere else. Because where the land can be reached, the pressure never lets up. In the rainforests of the northeast, near the Masoala Peninsula, grow some of the last great stands of rosewood and ebony, dense, dark, slow-growing tropical hardwoods. A single old rosewood tree can be worth a fortune, and almost all of that fortune is paid far away, in the furniture markets of wealthier nations, where the wood is turned into beds and chairs and carvings. So the trees are cut, often illegally, often in protected parks, hauled out by men who are paid a few dollars for the labor of felling a tree that took centuries to grow and will sell for thousands on the other side of the world. The loggers are not the ones who profit. They almost never are. The value flows outward, off the island, the way it has flowed outward since a French soldier first marched up from the coast. What makes the wood worth killing a forest for is simple physics and old taste. Rosewood is so dense it sinks in water, so fine-grained it polishes to a deep red-black, and so slow to grow that a tree worth taking may have stood for 200 or 300 years. Most of it is bound for the luxury furniture trade abroad, carved into reproductions of antique imperial designs for buyers willing to pay enormous sums for the weight of it. Because the trade is mostly illegal, the logs are hidden, stockpiled, and laundered, felled in a national park, floated down a river at night, then mixed into a legal-looking pile and shipped out through a port with the paperwork quietly arranged. By the time a chair reaches a showroom, the forest it came from has no voice left in the story. You see the same pattern, gentler but just as stubborn, in one of the island's sweetest exports. Along the humid northeast coast, In the region around the Bay of Antongil and on islands like Nosy Be, grows most of the world's vanilla. The thin black pods in kitchens from Paris to New York, the flavor in the ice cream and the perfume very likely began here, on a vine hand-pollinated one flower at a time by a Malagasy farmer. Vanilla is by weight one of the most valuable crops on Earth, at times worth more than silver, and the people who grow it remain among the poorest people in the world. The price is set in distant markets, rises and crashes on distant decisions, and the grower at the start of the chain absorbs the risk and keeps the smallest share. The same hands that produce a luxury the world pays dearly for go home to a house without electricity. Part of why it costs so much is the work itself. The vanilla orchid here has no natural pollinator. The insect that pollinates it in its original home across the Atlantic never lived on this side of the world. So every single flower must be pollinated by hand, by a person, using a sliver of bamboo to lift a tiny flap and press the pollen into place. And each blossom opens for less than a day. Miss it, and that flower will never become a pod. A farmer walks the rows at dawn, flower by flower, racing the clock for a harvest that will not be ready to sell for the better part of a year. When the price climbs, the desperation climbs with it. In the boom years, cured vanilla has been worth more than silver by weight, and that turned the growing regions dangerous. Pods are stamped with the farmer's own mark to prove ownership. Crops are guarded through the night. Thieves strip vines in the dark, and the violence that follows, beatings, killings, mobs taking justice into their own hands because no one else will, has left the Vanilla Coast tense and frightened in the very seasons it should be richest. A flavor the world associates with comfort, grown in fear. This is the engine underneath the burning, not greed, not ignorance, arithmetic. Madagascar has around 30 million people now, and the number is rising fast. Roughly 3 out of every 4 of them live in poverty. Close to 9 in 10 depend on wood and charcoal for the energy to cook their food, because there is no power line to most of the country. And the great majority are farmers who need land to grow rice, the food at the center of every Malagasy meal. The way you make new rice land, the way your parents and their parents made it, is called tavi. You cut a patch of forest, you let it dry, you burn it. The ash fertilizes the soil, and for 2 or 3 seasons it grows rice well. Then the thin tropical earth gives out, and you move on, and cut and burn the next patch. It was outlawed back in 1987. It continues almost everywhere because almost no one is ever punished for it, and because the alternative, for the family doing it, is to have nothing to eat. When you stand at the edge of a tavi fire and watch a hillside of ancient forest go up in an afternoon, the easy reaction is anger at the person holding the match. But the person holding the match has children, and no other field, and no other fuel, and no government able to offer them a different life. That is the trap the whole island is caught in, and no amount of looking away from the people in it will make it less true. And it is not only fire that eats the forest. In the late 1990s, prospectors found sapphires in the gravel of the south, near a place called Ilakaka. Within months, a few huts on a dirt road became a boom town of tens of thousands, men digging by hand into the earth with shovels and buckets, chasing stones that would end up in jewelry shops in distant cities. Whole stretches of dry forest were torn open and abandoned, the land left as a cratered moonscape of pits. As with the rosewood and the vanilla, almost none of the value stayed. The diggers earned a pittance for stones that were cut and sold for a fortune somewhere far away, and the forest cleared to reach them did not grow back. Fire, axe, and shovel. 3 different tools, the same wound. In recent years, the country has come apart at the top again. In late 2025, after years of corruption and collapsing services, of cities left for days without water or electricity, a wave of young protesters filled the streets of the capital. The president fled the country. The army stepped in. A new transitional leadership took power and promised elections within 2 years. It was, by one count, only the latest in a long line of upheavals. A state too unstable to do the one thing that might slow the loss of the forests, which is to give its people another way to live. Which brings us finally to the south, to the dry side of the great mountain wall, where the clouds arrive empty. Here grows a forest unlike any other on the planet, the spiny forest. It barely looks like forest at all. The plants are armored, twisted, covered in thorns, built to survive almost without rain. Tall, fluted columns of the octopus tree rise out of the ground like the limbs of something half-buried. Baobabs squat among them, storing water in their trunks against years of drought. Most of these plants belong to a family found nowhere else on Earth, and like so much of Madagascar, this place exists in this form on no other coast in the world. Everything here is built around the absence of water. The octopus trees drop their tiny leaves in the dry season and photosynthesize through their green bark instead, so they keep living on light alone when there is nothing to drink. The baobabs store thousands of liters inside their swollen trunks, drawing on the reserve through years when the rains do not come. And the thorns, the whole forest bristles with them, are a defense against animals that no longer exist. The plants are still armored against the giant tortoises and giant lemurs that once browsed here and have been gone for 1,000 years. The forest is fighting ghosts, still wearing armor for a battle the world already ended. Among those thorns moves one of the rarest reptiles on Earth, the radiated tortoise, its shell marked with fine golden lines spreading out from each plate like rays of light. It can live more than a century. It eats the spiny plants nothing else will touch, and it is being eaten toward extinction, taken by the thousand for its meat, and smuggled abroad for the exotic pet trade, where a single tortoise can sell for more than a Malagasy farmer earns in a year. A creature that outlived the giants, that survived everything the drought could throw at it, brought to the edge in a single human generation by a hunger far away for its shell and its flesh. And the south is also where the trap closes hardest. In the deep south, the rains have been failing for years. Drought after drought has hollowed out the harvests, and the region has slid into a famine the Malagasy called curated, a hunger so deep that families have survived on cactus fruit, on clay, on insects, on whatever the dying land still offers. People here have starved in a country that the world thinks of, when it thinks of it at all, as a postcard of friendly lemurs. Remember the rain that fell on the eastern wall and never made it over to this side? The same geography that built the rainforest built this hunger. The island's wonders and the island's suffering come from the same source. They always have. And now here, in the dry south, the elephant bird comes back. Because this is where its bones were found. This is the ground where, 10,000 years ago, a 3-meter bird walked among giants, and where, sometime in the last 1,000 years or so, the last of them died. The first ending happened here, The giant lemurs, the dwarf hippos, the great flightless bird with the dinosaur's egg. A whole world of large life, gone, leaving behind nothing but the bones in the marsh and a few cut marks to argue over. What is happening now is the second ending. Slower, quieter, but the shape is the same. A world built in deep isolation, irreplaceable because there is nowhere else it exists, meeting a human population with no choice but to consume it to live. The elephant bird did not vanish because anyone hated it. It vanished because in the end, the math of survival ran against it. The forests are vanishing for the same reason now. And this time, we are watching it happen with satellites, with science, with the full knowledge that 90% of these creatures live in this one place and will not be coming back from anywhere else. You can see the second ending from space. Those red rivers, the ones bleeding the color of the island's soil out into the blue ocean after every rain. That red is the land itself washing away. When the forest covered the hills, the roots held the soil in place. Stripped of forest, the rain carries the earth off the slopes and down the rivers and out to sea. The Great Red Island is, very literally, bleeding into the Indian Ocean, a little more with every storm, and from orbit, the plumes look exactly like a wound that will not close.
The fossa moves through what is left.
It is the island's great predator, a long, low, muscular animal, somewhere between a cat and a mongoose to look at, with a tail nearly as long as its body and the climbing skill to chase a lemur through the canopy. There were never any true cats here, and so, over millions of years, this one creature evolved to become the thing the lemurs feared. It is the closest Madagascar has to a leopard, and it too lives nowhere else. As the forest shrinks, so does the fossa's range, and so does the prey it needs, and so does the room for an animal that asks for nothing except that the trees keep standing. There is no clean way to end this part. The persistence we look for in these places, the temples still standing, the traditions still kept, the people still here against the odds, does not resolve the contradiction at the center of Madagascar. The forest is not enduring, it is going. The Indri that cannot live in a cage is running out of forest to live in. The arithmetic that feeds the family burns the world that the family is part of. Both things are still true, and saying it gently does not make them less true. So what do you do with a place like this? The world has two easy stories about Madagascar, and both of them are lazy. One is the postcard, the cartoon island of singing lemurs and friendly chaos, a backdrop for someone else's adventure. The other is the obituary, the doomed island, the tragedy, the cautionary tale of a paradise being thrown away by the people who live in it. Both stories let the rest of us off the hook. Both of them are told about Madagascar, almost never with it. The truer picture is harder and more hopeful at the same time. There are Malagasy scientists who have given their lives to this. Primatologists like Jonah Ratsimbazafi, who has spent decades arguing that the lemurs and the baobabs are not a luxury, but his country's true heritage, and that letting them burn is letting the country itself burn. There are reserves, like Ranamafana in the eastern forest, brought into being with the help of researchers like Patricia Wright, where the forest is not only protected, but where the protection pays local people to keep it standing, so that the math finally runs the other way. In a handful of places, the equation has begun quietly to flip. Where tourists come to see the Indri and the Sifaka, the money they spend can pay local guides and rangers and village funds until a living lemur in a standing forest is worth more year after year than the single harvest of rice the burned forest would have given. There are villages managing their own patches of forest under their own rules, deciding for themselves what may be cut and what is fadey. And there is a generation of young Malagasy, the same generation that filled the streets of the capital, planting trees, counting birds, learning the names of their own wildlife, and refusing the obituary that the rest of the world had already half written for them. None of it is winning yet. The forest is still falling faster than it is being saved. The honest answer to the question we started with, how does a world like this survive the century, is that no one knows, and that it depends on decisions not yet made, by people both on the island and far from it. But here is the thing about the phrase we began with. We called Madagascar the 8th continent, and it sounded like a curiosity, a piece of trivia. It is not. It is the most accurate description there is. This is not an exotic corner of Africa. It is a separate world, built over 88 million years of solitude, holding life that exists on no other continent because it had nowhere else to go. It is not, in the end, the 8th continent we discovered. It is the first one we are choosing whether or not to lose. The elephant bird does not get to come back. Neither will the Indri, or the fossa, or the spiny forest if the fires reach them. There is no other Madagascar drifting somewhere out in the ocean holding a spare copy. There is only this one, the piece that drifted alone, still out there in the warm water where the supercontinent left it, waiting to find out whether the century is kind. Take a breath. Stay with it a while longer. The island has been alone for a very long time. It would be a strange thing for the rest of us to look away now, at the one moment our looking might matter. Thank you for traveling with us. Until the next journey.